Investments in institution building have been a foundational tenet for Dasra. It is thus that all the money Dasra raises for nonprofits is unrestricted funds and can be leveraged towards institution building. But in the larger sector, this is still a point of discussion, and that needs to change. That's precisely the point of the next panel, Ready, Set, Grow. And with that, I hand it over to the panelists.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aditya, and welcome to the Royal Opera House. We are having a performance at the Royal Opera House today of Beauty and the Beast. It's a completely original production. In the role of Beauty is Archana, who runs a non-profit.
Chalo, first time I've been called that, so thank you for that.
And in the guise of the Beast is Dipa, who refuses to give non-profits money for capacity development.
I thought you were the beast.
Huh?
I thought you were the beast.
No, I'm the narrator.
How convenient.
But the story, as you know, goes all well because at the end of it, they fall in love with each other, and donors and NGOs are all working together. So don't worry about it. At the end, we're all good. The thing is that the NGO just needed to give the kiss to the...
I would have used the analogy of Peter and the world.
Okay. So the conversation here is about capacity development. We have a range of people in the audience from the nonprofit, philanthropy, and everything sector. I think the first thing I'd like to start with is, what does this word even mean? Because it's quite possible that each of us is sort of defining this a little differently. What does it mean from a nonprofit point of view? What does it mean from a donor point of view? Maybe even a service provider point of view. Would one of you like to start with that?
Sure. Happy to start with this one. So I think the way I understand capacity building in its simplest form is that you have an NGO, and the NGO has a core, right? And the core functions are maybe finance, HR, admin, communications, strategy, etc. And then you have the programs that evolve or come out of the core functions. So when you look at it holistically, you have to develop the capacities of the core functions in any organization to be able to deliver good or better programs. So it's almost like if you strengthen the core, you will actually get more value for every other resource that you put into the program, whether it's money, time, etc.
But isn't finance, admin, HR, everything what the CEO is supposed to do?
Really? I mean,
Aren't
really?
you supposed to be a superwoman and do everything?
My JD doesn't read like that. My JD says you just look after all these people and support all the people who are supposed to do each of the functions that we talked about. And I think, therefore, it's very, very important to strengthen the capability and the capacity of each of these so-called non-core or admin functions before you're actually able to improve on the programs itself.
Dipa, would you agree with that definition, or do you look at it slightly differently?
So I think I would agree with that. What we find is that NGOs typically start with charismatic leaders who are committed to a particular cause, health, education, or the environment, or whatever it may be. And they start out, performing all those functions on their own. And I'm sure that you've probably seen that. You're a fundraiser, you're the administrator, you're managing the phones, you're doing communication, all of that. But as you grow, you would want to institutionalize each of these functions. So you would like to get folks who are appropriately credentialed or have experience in each of these functions to start taking that over. And as it is our role as a donor to kind of recognize when that tipping point is happening, where you need, what is the kind of support that an NGO would require at that, particular point in their growth where they could benefit from getting this support either through, you may call it, there are many different mechanisms to support an NGO to do that, but how would you strengthen each of those functions so that they are better able to deliver on their core mission, which may be education or whatever, again, it is. But I think it is for the NGO to articulate what they need, and it's for the donor to kind of recognize that, that recognize that need and also come forward and say, how do I support this NGO in its transition? I think we can't talk about audacious philanthropy or big bets and all of that without recognizing that, that there is this other bit, not glamorous bit of running NGOs and in kind of keeping them going that needs to be supported.
But I find it a little unusual to be having this conversation with a donor, because the only thing the donor normally asks me, and I run a nonprofit too, is all the money going to the child? And you're telling me I should spend money on communications, HR, admin. Wouldn't there be a pushback from somewhere two down from you, telling me, why am I spending on this communications person?
I can't speak for other donors, so I'll speak for MacArthur Foundation, which is where I've spent the last couple of decades. I think we rarely push back on many of these things. This is a process of negotiating. You sit down, you get to understand what the NGO needs. We have very rarely quibbled with salaries. We have very rarely quibbled with overheads. In fact, we constantly, we have a maximum of 15% overheads that we give our NGOs. Many of the Indian NGOs don't even come in at 15%. We are the ones who say, we know that the international NGOs, Save the Children, etc., definitely would ask for 15% and more. Why is it that our Indian NGOs are not even, don't even ask us for what we would give? So I'm working with the NGOs to say, why are you at 7%? Why are you not at 15%, which we are offering you? There are other things that we may do. We may say that you need to hire another additional person to do this work. I don't think you can have one person and say you're covering a district. It's just not realistic. So that is a kind of a conversation you have.
Archana seems to have a different point of view.
No. I just wanted to add to that. I think in every relationship, you need to give it time, right? And during that time, you need to build that relationship from where it started. So it may have started as, here is 100 rupees towards a program. And take that donor-donee relationship to the next level, where you make the donor a part of your journey, right? And you take it beyond that 100 rupees that they're giving to you as a grant. And during that process, you actually share your pains, your strengths, your weaknesses, your challenges with them very honestly. And therefore, when you go back to them and say, look, I'm really struggling with this, together you may be able to find an area which needs capacity building on, right? So sometimes when, and this I say from our experience through the A.T. Chandra Foundation, I don't know where you need capacity as a funder. And you as a NGO, depending on where you are in your growth cycle, may or may not be able to figure out where you need to build capacity. So you have to understand that the NGOs are coming with pure passion. I want to change the life of this child on the ground, and therefore on a daily basis, I'm very excited to go and work with him. If you're asking me to step back and think about what the organization is going to look like 5 years ago, I may or may not have the inclination or the ability to do that. And therefore, as a funder, if you say, look, this is great, the program you're running on the ground is great, but let's just step back and talk about where are we going to be 5 years hence, and then let's build capacity towards that. I think that, so once you've done that together, there's no reason why they won't give you the money to do that. And therefore, it's a win-win situation for both the donor as well as the recipient.
So the first part of this I get, which is that there seems to be, what is capacity building? It's all the non-core functions which don't directly deliver to the child or directly deliver to a woman or directly deliver a skilling program. There are certain organizational functions which are required to support the program delivery. Until there, I'm with you. Now, after that, how did this 15% number come, that that's how much it should be?
So I don't know where what the history of the 15% number is. I think a number of foundations have kind of hit on this number, but I also know that in the US that several foundations are discussing whether 15% is adequate. And they're thinking about whether to, I don't know what it'll be eventually, but they're talking about upping it to even 20, 25%. Because I think when you want to and in the last panel, there was conversation about how do you strengthen an institution? How do you create, worthwhile or NGOs that are fairly small in scale and their reach is kind of limited, how do you get them to grow into these large organizations? And that is where we have found, at least many of the organizations, even in India, that have grown, have received this kind of support to institutionalize some of these functions, which frees some of the top leaders to be really thinking and kind of growing the space itself. So without allowing for that, I don't see, you are also tying your organization to this, to work on a small scale. So we continue to talk about big change,
while still being small
yeah,
scale.
but actually your actions are such that you're binding these NGOs as
So
well.
what is the constraint? It seems like if we define this as needing to build the core, non-profits need it. Some enlightened funders are willing to support it. Why is it not happening then? Or is it happening?
I think it's happening.
Okay.
And I'd like to believe that this is again a journey, right? When the
So
CSR...
Archana, I want to quote from the report that Dasra says.
Sure.
When you say it's happening, 68% of non-profit organizations surveyed said that the biggest challenge is in building capacities is inadequate funding. 68%. So how can we say it's happening? 2/3 of people are saying there's no money for it.
So 32% said yes.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
No, here's my thing, Aditya. I think it's very easy to focus on the pain, right? What is not working. And I think as people in the not-for-profit space, we have to think of what's working and how to make more of it work. So let me give you an example of our own space. So in 2013-14, when the CSR bill came out, right? A lot of organizations just did it because it was mandatory. And I actually saw nothing wrong with that. And therefore, it was given as a role or a function to be performed by internal people who already had existing roles, right? So your HR person or your admin head also started doing CSR, and they may or may not have even understood the magnitude of the portfolio that they had now been given. Come 2019, I think even for each one of the companies and the people who are playing the role of the CSR head have evolved. They have had conversations, they have been to NGOs, they've seen the work on the ground, and they understand the need for this space, which is why 32% are getting it, right? It's just a matter of time before the others, through conversations like this, through people like us who actually put our pain out there with different people.
So do you think non-profits are asking for this money, Archana? I mean, because I feel that there's a sense of guilt in the non-profit, as a non-profit leader, that if I ask for this money, what is the donor going to think about me? Is he going to think that I'm lazy, that I'm not willing to do all these functions? Is he going to think that I'm not focused on my beneficiary?
Yes.
Are you sure
So
the non-profit
unfortunately, I think, again, the mindset is a little bit like that. Because you have to understand, again, when a person starts an NGO, they are coming with pure passion, pure drive, and pure belief that I am going to change the life of this person or this section or this community, right? And therefore, all my time, as well as the resources that I have access to, should go to this beneficiary. That's the true belief that I come with into this space, right? It's only a couple of years into this, do I really understand that if I do everything myself, like you wanted me to do finance, HR, PR, there's only that much that I can do, because no matter how passionate I am, I don't have more than 24 hours a day. And therefore, it is in my interest, in the interest of the cause, that I build leverage or capacity in the institute.
So what is the constraint then? Do you think that
it's a mindset change?
In the donor or in
Both.
the NGO head?
In both. So we talked earlier about the mindset change by making them partners in your journey at the donor level. My point is, I think we need to even have that at the NGO leader level. Why not? And make them understand that it is not a bad
But
thing.
what do I do when I feel, so let's assume I sort of know that I need these functions, but I feel guilty. I feel guilty asking for this money.
I think you need to get access to people who can put this into the correct framework for you to think about, right? We all have our preconceived notions of what is good and what is not good. What should I feel guilty about? If I'm not nice to my mother-in-law, I should feel guilty about, etc. But I think it's very important to put the landscape and what you're doing and the resources that you have access to into the right perspective. And therefore, having conversations with people who can help you do this is priceless.
Dipa seems to.
Yeah, I just like to add,
You need to be closer, probably, Dipa.
I don't think you want to just come up to a donor and say, I'd like X, Y, Z. I would think that you would want to have, you would either have gone through some sort of strategy process and you've kind of worked it out, like you mentioned. You've said that for the next phase of growth, this is what I need. Would you be, and you obviously have built that trust with the donor who's supporting, both, has been supporting you for a while, typically not a first round conversation, but you want to then come back and say, this is what we have identified as our need. What part of this could you support? We've supported NGO leaders who felt burnt out to take sabbaticals. And they've come back recommitted, they've gone out, they've talked to experts, they've seen other projects, they've come back with brilliant ideas. So it could be a variety of different things, but I don't think you want to be unprepared when you have that conversation.
So I'm curious, there's a lot of people in the audience. I'd love a poll. I don't know who's responsible for the poll here. But if you open out your app, if everyone could just open up their app, I want to put a poll up there. Are nonprofits generally proactive in asking for funding for their institutional building requirements? I really want to know what the audience thinks. Archana seems to believe that we should all feel confident and ask for it. I feel that we're all feeling guilty and don't ask for it. I wonder what the audience feels. Maybe we give you 30 seconds to.
You do know we're not responsible for the audience poll.
I'm sorry?
We're not responsible for their opinion, right? As long as we're clear on that.
Maybe we wait 15 more seconds.
I think it's going in the right direction. And the point is not whether they're asking today or not, but should they ask or not.
But clearly we're not asking. So that's a shift we need to potentially start making.
Absolutely. So it's almost like moving from capacity building or individual program building to institutional building, right?
So the poll seems to be around 25% seem to be asking, 75% are not asking. The survey which Dasra did said 32% are getting, 68 are not getting. So the numbers are sort of, about a third of people are probably asking and a third of people are getting. But 2/3 are not asking and 2/3 are not getting. So if that number needs to change in the next TPW 2022, that could be a great target for Neera and gang. Maybe 75% of us need to be asking and 75% of us need to be supporting. But moving on from the asking and the supporting, just coming in more from the donor perspective, do donors feel guilty, individual philanthropists feel guilty giving money for stuff like this? Wouldn't I as a donor prefer to give money directly to a child? I've grown up on this, give directly some food, give directly a computer, give clothes. Isn't there a sort of collective consciousness around the immediate gratification in a philanthropist? It's not easy for me to transition as a donor from that immediate gratification to, I'm going to build this institution, and then maybe someday that institution will cause impact, and then therefore I will get some level of gratification. You're asking me to delay too much gratification.
So, I'm not an individual philanthropist. I work for a foundation. I think just as we ask NGOs to have a strategy for growth, I think similarly, most foundations or most philanthropists should have some strategy for how they want to impact the field. And you may start off, just like the NGO started off with helping one child and one woman or in 10 villages. Similarly, you may, in your growth as a philanthropist, like to see how you would like to impact the sector. And yes, you may continue to support a school in your hometown or a hospital in your hometown, and there's nothing wrong with that, because I think there is something about seeing the results on an immediate basis. But you'd also want to see how would these NGOs grow and impact the field itself? How would you want to do, impact primary education or secondary education, or get more women in the workforce, or something like that, some larger strategic mission that you want to aim for, and what do you need to do to get there? So I think just as NGOs
it's too difficult, right,
do it,
Dipa? Because I feel like an individual philanthropist, I feel too small to think of something large like that. It's much easier to say, okay, my maid's daughter doesn't have enough money to go to school. I need to give her money for that. My maid's daughter's wedding needs to happen. I need to give her a soft loan for that. Anything more than that is complicated, I think, as a philanthropist. To start saying, okay, I give to a local NGO run by a friend's daughter, that's fine. But now you're asking me institution building, it's too difficult.
So just like you collaborate on the NGO level, I think you also collaborate at the philanthropist level. And Dasra is a good example of that. That enables this conversation to get going. So I would imagine that there may be giving circles of a few philanthropists who come together and try to say, okay, let's try and do this. It can be on a grand scale and it may be at a smaller scale, but it doesn't take away from the fact that, and maybe not everybody would get into supporting institution building, but just remember that when you do it like that, like if all your life you're giving and all you're doing is this piecemeal giving, then your impacts are likely to be, kind of limited as well.
So we need to grow as donors as well.
So I think there's nothing wrong with instant gratification, right? And I think that's really the way a person's journey in this space begins. I think what one needs to do is help that person move on in the journey and understand. So that's what we do with our donors. When you make them a part of your journey, you say, this is great for program, I will feed the child, educate the child, etc. But going forward, can you help me build corpus? So of the 100 rupees that you give me, can I put away 10 towards building corpus, which gives me interest, which I can use as unrestricted funding to try new pilots, of which some will work and some won't. So I think this is merely, again, a evolution at the donor level, NGO level, and even at the individual who wants to contribute.
So what stage do you think funders are? Like we said, non-profit leaders still feel guilty, maybe only 25% ask. But individual philanthropists, what phase do you think we are in India? I want to ask both of you. What phase do you think philanthropists are in this journey? Do you think 10% would fund this sort of work? Do you think 2% will fund? Do you think 70% will fund?
So I have to admit, I'm not the data person. Dasra might be able to answer that better. But what I do know is that at our foundation level, capacity building is really a strong focus area for us. And when we look at capacity building, we do it at 3 levels. We do it, one, as capacity building at the organizational level, where we talk to our NGOs and we say, what is it that you want to do at your next level of growth? The other would be actually at a talent level, right? Which is, I think the ask from the not-for-profit sector is huge, yes. The resources that are available to us in terms of just talent, money, etc., is limited. And therefore, we have to be able to train leaders to be able to excel in these roles. And therefore, we've partnered with Harvard through the SNMI program, SPINIM, as well as with Dasra and the AP and leadership program to build capacity at an ecosystem level for talent. And the third capacity building that we do at a foundation level is in the area of identifying what are the gaps in the sector as a whole. What I mean by that is, you need more platforms to be able to allow people to give. So therefore, the Give India platform or the Dasra platform, in terms of knowledge, we've partnered with IDR and support them to build capacity so you can share the knowledge in this space. Culturally, in India, to build the culture of giving. So we've again support, the Dan Utsav or the Giving Tuesday initiative. So I'm just breaking it down into multiple levels of capacity
at the organization level, at a sort of talent pool level, and at the ecosystem
level. As well as
level.
at the sector level.
But I'm curious again, I think I'd love this another audience poll. What percentage of funders do we think, if we can take out our devices again, I'm curious to see what the audience thinks, what percentage do funders adequately understand the importance of investing in talent and talent management? You know, we're sounding eloquent here with regard to having thought this through, but is the average funder there? I mean, is it yes, no, or somewhat? I'm curious to see what the audience has to say about this. What is your actual experience of funders? Could we put up the poll?
I find these polls very scary.
Why?
You don't know what you're going to get.
Absolutely, that's the fun part. But yes is like never going above 10, 12%. So another metric for Dasra to work on, to convert the somewhats to yes. You know, it's never going above 10, 12%. The somewhat is 38%, but really if we need proactive organization building and scale up, this is probably very key. So we've sort of established what capacity development is. It's all the non-core functions. We're sort of seeing why there are gaps in the non-profit to be able to ask for this. There's guilt, there's whatever, there's, you know, maybe you don't know about it, there's capacity. And then there is the side on the funder side. It's a funder also, you know, there's a bit of resistance, gratification. We are evolving as a funding group as well. I think both of you have worked a lot in this space. I'd love to end with sort of sharing your experience as funders when you've gone into this space. Is it actually possible to get success in this? I mean, how do you even put metrics around this? I mean, if I'm going to fund some capacity development of one person going to a Harvard program, how do I do this?
So the MacArthur Foundation...
No, I don't think it's...
So the MacArthur Foundation decided to fund in the field of reproductive health somewhere around the mid-90s. And when we looked around, you know, there was all this focus on population control and sterilization, etc. So we started to feel the need for actually building capacity amongst individuals to think about how do you work on issues of health and well-being rather than of, you know, like just controlling populations. So we started off with supporting individuals, about a cohort of 65 individuals over a 10-year period. Intense efforts were made to take these mid-career professionals and build them
they were from different organizations?
Most didn't have organizations.
Oh.
So what happened was that many went on to seed organizations.
I see.
Many went on and are working in the donor space themselves. Some of them are in
Talk
governments.
about field building. You literally
some
built
are
the
in
talent
government,
for the
some
field.
are in UN systems, and they're able to kind of influence the field in India and even globally. And then in our process of funding NGOs, you know, there were many, I mean, we've talked about different instances of how we, you know, supported NGOs, made unrestricted grants, allowed them to even purchase assets, etc. And now, as we are exiting the field of reproductive health in India, we have made a grant to Dasra to just work, however, you know, to work with our grantee portfolio to figure out what is it that they need as we exit. So we've given them this unrestricted funds to kind of work with NGOs so that we leave them in a good place even as we leave the field. So that's one cycle of how we began.
But you're really asking to take a very field view on this. You're asking to take a long-term view on this. You're asking me to be patient. You're asking me to take a lot of risk, because out of these 55 people, it's, you know, anyone would ask saying, what happens if 10% of them don't do anything? Doesn't it look bad? Type of thing. So you're asking me to be very risky and take a sort of long-term view. I know AT does a lot of investments as well. I'm sort of putting in your lens as a funder as well, Archana. Have you had success doing this? Would you endorse for others to do this? How do you measure whether it's...
Absolutely. I mean, in the interest of time, I'm going to say I completely agree with what Dipa has to say. You couldn't do it any other way.
You have to take a medium-term view and go ahead and do this. Great, so that's a tough ask on both Beauty and the Beast. We both need to move from where we are at the moment. But are there any questions from the audience as to how, what they're taking away from this, what you are struggling with individually? Yeah, there seem to be a few hands here.
Hello, good morning. Anna Bruni from the Confluencers. I have a reflection and a question.
Sure.
My reflection is, you mentioned guilt and sort of the fear of pushback. And my experience has been that I think that's, in some cases, it's rooted in a lack of understanding on the NGO part of the value and the worthiness of their own knowledge and expertise. And I feel that sometimes that leads to lack of confidence in making the ask and almost this fear of the pushback. And actually, I think we should embrace the fear and conquer the fear, because the problem with obviously not asking is not just that obviously you don't stand a chance of getting the funding, but also that the donor's understanding of what is needed is limited.
Correct.
Because from the donor side, the donor can only fund what they understand and make decisions based on the information that they're given. So yeah, I suppose a call to be bold and make the ask.
So don't feel guilty, recognize your self-worth.
And the value of the unique knowledge that NGOs have.
Up to the bring, absolutely.
And the question is with regard to the 15% or 25%. Do you think that it's fair to put a number? Because, or do you think that actually we should look at maybe quantifying the value, the outcomes behind these fluffier activities? And the reason I ask that is that different sectors have different proportions of capacity building. So if you work in a space which requires a lot more research or learning to develop and to be able to deliver value for your beneficiaries, then yeah.
It's a great question. Actually, one of my friends said, you know, when you're buying a soap at Hindustan Lever, when you buy a Lux, you don't ask him how much is the overhead in producing the Lux, right? You just say, what is the final cost, and is that the lowest? And so where did this 15% come from? Is it a fair number? Is it fair to apply it to everybody?
So as I said, I have to admit, I don't know how that 15% came about, except that it seemed like something that covered, most NGOs could live with. But I know that, but we are reflecting on whether that is correct or not, and that we need to, we can increase it. And it's up to whatever.
We have a question here.
So just to add to that, I think we should use these numbers or whether it's 15 or 25, really as indicators, because depending on where the organization is in terms of their own journey, are they at their startup stage, consolidation, it's going to be different. And
for a small organization, it might be a disproportionate amount of your cost at the moment.
Absolutely, and therefore I think everybody, including the NGO and the donor, should look at it, more with a framework perspective as opposed to a sacrosanct number perspective.
I know that Bridgespan ran a whole program in the US saying pay what it takes. Right, based on their research, saying what does it take to solve the problem, not what is this thing. Yes?
So I have, my name is Parul, and I'm from an organization called Shaisho, based in Gujarat.
Yes, Parul.
As a grassroots organization, we face several challenges in getting this kind of support. One, that the budget of the small grassroots organization is limited. So even if there is like 15% or whatever, then to get that kind of qualified person at the grassroots level who can offer this kind of work is very difficult to find such person. Second challenge is, getting such kind of person at working in big cities, yes, but in the smaller cities to get such professional itself is a big challenge. And the third, which is even more challenging, is that, right now, more or less the donor organization support for 1 year, at the most 3 years. So building this kind of long-term, I know MacArthur does, because some of the organizations that I know MacArthur has supported for very long time.
I agree with you. So I think we didn't spend enough time on the actual, apart from the funding, there's an actual talent question. How do you get talent, and then how do you get them in smaller towns?
Yeah.
Because Dasra suddenly cut our session to 30 minutes.
Long-term partnership is also very limited.
So because you all had tea for too long, so you can't ask any more questions now. So what do we do on the talent issue?
Okay, so your point is completely valid, ma'am. And yes, I know your questions are more at the rural area, grassroots level area, but let me give you an example of what we've done at our own NGO, which is the Vakeel Foundation. I think we wanted to up the bar of everything that we were doing at the organization from a core strengthening perspective, but we didn't have access to funds. So whether that meant in our communication, whether that meant in our whole MIS system, we didn't have the money to pay for these capacity building initiatives. And actually that's when I did one of these courses at Harvard where they taught you how to think out of the box. I have to admit, I went to a school where I mugged up the textbook, I spewed it out at the exam time, I got great results, but I didn't know how to think out of the box. And in a space like ours, you have to be able to think outside the regular structured framework. So, you know, the Harvard course actually helped me do that, and it taught me how to. And when we came back, to give you an example, when we had to build our MIS, we couldn't afford to pay the vendor what their ask was. So we started looking around and saying, who else in the corporate world encourages their employees to volunteer? And we came across Edelweiss. We went to Edelweiss and said, this is what we want to do. Can you be our knowledge partners in this, where your employee holds the project for us, helps us understand what we need to do with our data, and then outsource it to your existing vendor? We got the whole technology piece built at a throwaway price, but actually with the Edelweiss brain power,
Fantastic.
right? So my point in this is, think about ways whereby you can leverage or access talent, and not necessarily through the engaging as an employee model.
I know that several of your senior managers are also sort of pro bono and...
Yes, so Vakeel is actually flourishing because we have learned the hard way on how to leverage very high quality caliber and talent in the market space.
So like
through
with
the volunteer
crowdsourcing
model.
money, we have to crowdsource talent as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I was specifically told not to mention his name, but we have Sri Rajan from Bain in this room who has actually been our strategy partner for over 10 years. And even before I came into this room, he was like, Archana, where are you on strategy? What's going on with this, right? And I think just having access to this caliber who constantly watches your back and helps you go to the next level in a non-paying format is magical.
We just have one last question maybe. Yes, Rohini?
Yeah, sorry to take this time, but I would love a very interesting discussion, very important one. Can we address, all three of you briefly, the elephant in the room of the sector is, and thus it's a good place to talk about this, that the social sector and volunteerism, self-restraint, swayam seva, all that goes together. It is constricting, the sector is professionalizing, but both donors and civil society activists sometimes feel that they have to constrain themselves materially, right? That it should all come from your heart and your pocket shouldn't be involved. Can you address that? What is the right way to think about it? Because that spirit is still very important, right? The Gandhian spirit is very important, but how do you balance these two things?
Okay, elephant in the room.
I thought we didn't have time for this.
Now Dasra has to decide whether we want to deal with the elephant or we put it under the carpet. Yeah?
If I may, I think you need to balance it, and I don't think you can monetize everything in our sector, in the nonprofit sector. But the question is that while, so I like your idea of thinking, using volunteers. A lot of people have started to use, and many of our grantees are using consultants with, to help with building out websites, and there are some here. You don't have to hire talent. You can even club things together when you work as a consortium.
Yeah.
Maybe they build out something that others can use. So I think you have to be able to think creatively around this. But I do think we are all driven by heart in this, and we will be continued to be, whether on the donor side or the NGO side, yes.
So I think what's worked for us, Rohini, and we've tried several models, but I think at Vakeel, what we do is when a person comes to us, right, whether it's a donor looking to give funds or it's somebody looking to give time, we actually encourage them to walk around the campus, understand our journey, because Vakeel is completing 75 years this year in the space of intellectual disability, which is actually not a space that people are naturally inclined to support unless they've been affected in their own lives. It's a tough space. So we actually encourage them to do that tour, to understand our journey, and then we bring them back into the room and say, okay, what do you think, right? Does the place and does the cause make your heart sing? If the answer to that is yes, then we say, okay, what are your capabilities? What would you like to do? And we actually marry that to what it is that we want in the organization. We do that even with our donors. So we always say it's not enough. We need your money. We love you for your money. But you have to come and spend time with my child, whether it is you individually at a CSR committee level, your leadership level, or even at your employee engagement level. And I think that's how you get the marriage of the head and the heart to happen, right? I think individually, no one, either the head or the heart, is able to function over a long period of time independently. And therefore, making that marriage happen is important.
Great. I'm not allowed to answer as a moderator, but this is a question that I'm going to answer. I have 8 people on my team who were previously at the corporate level paid $1 crore or more of salary, right? You can't even imagine how much less. I mean, I think their salary must be less than the surcharge on their tax that they were paid in their previous jobs. But this is the elephant in the room. How are we going to deal with this? And I hope there's as much evolution in this as well, because I think then only talent is going to be available. But at the moment, there isn't. And I think that is a problem. So great. Before Dasra throws me out and never invites me for another philanthropy week, thank you very much for the discussion. Beauty and the Beast, please kiss and make up. And thank you very much.